Well, I'd like to wait until we have some more people on the line who I believe are joining, including some members of our Global Fragility Act Mel group. But I'm not sure. Do we have any leeway at the end in terms of timing? Bronca or Eugene? Okay, so there isn't a meeting scheduled right after this one, so maybe we'll just give it a few more minutes. Hi, John. I see one member of our Mel group.
Michelle, hi everybody. I was waiting to be unmuted by Eugene. This is Branka speaking. There is the next session. Well, actually, you can take like 5 minutes more if you need. If you just see that this discussion is still ongoing.
Okay.
Good luck. I look forward to hearing you all.
Thank you. Let's see, who else do I have? Yeah, let's just give it a couple of more minutes. Okay, well. Sorry. All right, well, I think we are just going to go ahead and kick it off, and others will join, hopefully more of my USG colleagues. First off, my name is Michelle Seif, and I'm a Center for Global Development Fellow, currently detailed to the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance. And I do want to thank NYU's Center for International Cooperation and the Complex Risk Analytics Fund for organizing and funding this terrific conference. So we know that it is a very grave global moment, and this is a very global conference. But I thought it would be, I wanted to kick us off actually with a quote from one of my favorite American and funniest writers, Mark Twain, who once said, "If we were meant to talk more than listen, we would have 2 mouths and 1 ear." So I hope some of you are chuckling behind your muted mics. But I think that's a good intro to this panel, which is entitled Listening for Peace, Local Feedback Loops, and Peacebuilding Success. And just to provide a little more context for this panel, I think most of the conference has been focused on many high-tech data types, such as high-frequency geospatial data, AI, big data, blockchain, and so forth. And these are definitely important. But I wanted to inject into this conversation a discussion of what might be considered lower tech data, in that it's a data type that's been around for a while, data which measures the perspectives of local actors about external peace-building interventions. And this is a topic that we have been discussing very seriously in the Global Fragility Act's Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Group. So in order to advance that mission, I've pulled together a group of expert practitioners and scholars to help us dive into this topic. We have with us today Susanna Campbell, who's an associate professor at American University's School of International Service and director of the Research on International Policy Implementation Lab. And she's also author of a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, Global Governance and Local Peace, Accountability and Performance in International Peacebuilding. We also have Bushra Hassan. She is a MEL advisor in the UN Peacebuilding Support Office. We have Patrick Vinck, who's an assistant professor at Harvard University and director of the Peace and Human Rights Data Program. And we have Ruth Rhoads Allen, who is president of CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. So in terms of logistics, I'm just going to pose 2 questions to the panel and do a round robin of answers, and then basically open up 2 questions for the remaining 15 to 20 minutes. So if that sounds good, I'm going to just move us into the first question, which is, so for all of you who have a lot of experience in these methods, why have you come to believe that local feedback data is so important to peace building success? How is this data type similar to or different from the other types of data collected through traditional MEL systems? And if you have implementation experience, can you provide concrete examples of how you implemented these systems in the field? And I'm going to start off with Susanna.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks for doing this. And I see lots of friends in the audience as well as on the panel. So really excited for this conversation. Why is local feedback so essential to peace building success? I mean, first of all, peace building attempts to change a changing context. So any initial idea of what you're going to do is going to be wrong at some point. And so you have to adapt to the context. Change, adaptation requires feedback. You don't need feedback from people outside of the context to say whether it's working or not. You actually need feedback from people within the context. And you don't just need feedback from one actor or another. If you're trying to support peace, it means you're actually trying to address diverse perspectives and enable diverse, often conflicting people to be listened to. So that means that you need feedback from a diverse group of stakeholders. Importantly, this feedback serves kind of two functions. It gives you regular evidence of success and failure. When you listen to that as a programmer, when you're implementing a program, or even as a donor, when you listen to that feedback and you alter what you're doing in a way that actually reduces the gap between your aims and your outcomes, then you are learning. Without that feedback, you can make changes, you can adapt, but you could be doing it all in the wrong direction. So adaptation on its own is not sufficient. Feedback from an inclusive, representative group of domestic stakeholders is actually what gives you the opportunity to learn and increase the likelihood that you achieve your peace building outcomes. I can go into all of this more. In my book, I call that down, the thing that creates that feedback, I call it informal accountability, because you are actually giving the authority to a group of domestic stakeholders to inform, to tell you whether you're doing good or bad work, right? And you're actually committing to listening to them. And that's really important. And that's what makes a big distinction between kind of normal M&E systems or MEL systems and any kind of true feedback loop. So MEL systems are designed to focus on the needs and priorities of the donor or the programming actor outside the country. So they're very top down and they're very static, no matter how kind of adaptive you try to make them. And so what we're talking about here can complement a MEL system, but is not part and parcel of any kind of huge indicator development process necessarily, because when you develop indicators, you predetermine what you're going to pay attention to and what you're going to listen to. That means that there's a lot of feedback that you wouldn't actually listen to. And I think really importantly here is the notion that the informal accountability mechanisms that I'm talking about aren't just this kind of extractive, I'm taking data from you mechanism. It's actually really engaging in relationship with domestic stakeholders so that they can buy into and influence the peace building program, right? The more that they buy into it, the more likely they are to help sustain its outcomes, the more likely it is actually to be successful. I think I'll stop there, Michelle. We can go on to examples and stuff later on, I assume. Or do you want me to go into those now? I can give an example.
If you have one example of when you've supported implementation, I think that would be helpful. And you're still
I'm going to give two. I'm going to give two. So I see Brian on the line, and this is so the PBSO, actually the PBF in my research has supported some pretty interesting and innovative examples. And there are two that are really important. So one was this project that was trying to reform the SNR, which is the intelligence service in Burundi. It was a super tricky, risky project. And what the UN did that was really innovative was it hired one of the very well-respected domestic human rights organizations to actually periodically evaluate whether or not the project was working. And it made the continuation of the project and the continuation of funding contingent on that feedback. And so what you did in that instance was give a representative group of domestic stakeholders represented by this national human rights NGO, gave them the authority to influence and determine the future direction of this project. That ensured that it was not just grounded in the priorities of outside donors or even in the government, but was actually in a very politicized situation, grounded in the reality of the human rights situation on the ground. The second one was with the Cadre de Dialogue program, a dialogue program in Burundi around the same time. And there the UN enabled, it took a small group of the dialogue participants and it gave them the authority to actually monitor and evaluate whether the dialogue project was working. So it embedded a mechanism within its M&E process and within its decision-making process that actually gave domestic stakeholders who represented the diversity within that dialogue program the authority to give regular feedback about what was working and what wasn't, and help to shape the future of the program. So this is fundamentally different than a kind of standard M&E system because it gives authority to domestic stakeholders to shape the behavior of the external actor. I'll stop there now.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Susanna. Bushra.
Thanks. Happy to be coming in after the examples from PBSO. So what really happens is generally MEL systems, when we design them, they play more of an accountability function, which requires reporting against, quantitative, efficiency-driven, easy to collect indicators. Unfortunately, these indicators for success or failure are geared more towards performance against activity-driven targets and financial viability. So the focus on investments, on monitoring, is more or less to affirm that the right things are being done by us and that the money is being spent wisely. So in such a way, MEL systems can often be self-serving and risk-averse. When local feedback systems are set up, they focus less on self-reporting and more on the assessment of the context of the project, in which we are but one of the actors. So the priority, therefore, is on learning and on being accountable, but not just to governments or our funding partners or host governments, but to the people who we are there to support and serve. So in a way, you have different kinds of local feedback mechanisms, quantitative, qualitative, etc. And while quantitative services enable us to get a quick sense of what needs to be done, we found that without listening to people, without being part of conversations, we cannot truly even interpret the quantitative data collected. And I'll come to our example now. We have recently completed a baseline data collection exercise with 3IE and ISDC as our partners. Now, this was a very robust and scientific impact evaluation and at a baseline state. So I wouldn't go into the methodology of that. But essentially, the project was around land rights and conflict resolution among agrarian communities. And the theory of change really was working around reducing conflict or violence and building the capacities or the trust of formal mechanisms with the local communities. When we went and collected the data, we got 3 main results. And that was really around, and what was tricky for us was what we actually found, is that communities said that they normally accept violence as a possible conflict resolution mechanism. Some of them thought that it was appropriate, and a small percentage of them also thought that it was effective. At the same time, the perception of effectiveness of formal mediation mechanisms, such as trust in public institutions, was already quite high. So when you looked at the quantitative data, we thought, oh, so they already think that violence is effective, or it's appropriate, which is not what we had thought before. And they think that public institutions already are working well. So this was a surprise for us. But as with any local feedback mechanisms, we had to complete the loop. We had to go back to the communities and said, when we had this assessment, this is what we are getting from you. So there was kind of a data return activity. So PBSO, along with our partners and country colleagues, they went back with the idea to allow the evaluators to nuance the analysis and collect further qualitative data, triangulate it, and basically complete the loop. And what we found was actually very, very different. First of all, when it comes to trust and formal mediation mechanisms, communities tend not to even go to formal mechanisms. They tend to resolve conflicts among themselves. So the idea of a formal system, they're assuming they must be effective, but it's not something that they practice because there's a high transaction cost, there's travel, they have to stop working to even access them. So there's a financial repercussion for them to go. There's language that can be an obstacle. So when they said, yes, we trust mechanism, it's trusting something that you're not necessarily engaging with in that way. And when they said they accepted violence, we wanted to go and ask them, how do you define violence? And their definition of violence was, well, you know, we did a roadblock, or we decided to go on strike for a day. And that kind of definition of violence from our side, where we have such a big global portfolio, was something that we had to understand from them. Because if we just ask somebody, do you accept violence? Their definition of violence was what we would just call normal forms of resistance. So recognizing that even the quantitative data and the way that questions are structured has implications on how they're assessed. And we have to go back to even understand, what does that even mean? And at the end of the day, what we have to do is enable the people who have given us that data to be able to help us understand and interpret that data as well. And we have a next question. So in that way, I'm going to then talk about why it's important that once we've listened, to use that data to adapt. Otherwise, you can't just be wasting their time on your own. You have to be able to fix your programming, adjust your programming, and at the end of the day, like Susanna already said, be accountable to them. I'll stop here.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Bushra. Patrick.
Sure. You know, I'm not sure I have anything to add, so I'm going to do something I didn't think I was going to do. I will actually quickly show, as Susanna and Bushra were talking, I decided to quickly pull 4 slides that I think really illustrate well what is meant here and what we are discussing. And I do have a public health, you know, affiliation, so I hope you don't mind if I talk about latrines and sanitation. But, you know, when we sit comfortably, this is the vision. We want to build the latrines, and these are important for public health, for hygiene. Maybe these are in a school. So that's the vision that we articulate. Very often that's done, you know, unfortunately outside of context or with limited input. But say we have a vision. Indeed, Brian is on the call, so we are going to talk about the idea that very often, well, you know, why don't we just say that this is for peace? So now we're going to build, instead of just building latrines, we're going to build latrines for peace. Ideally, we would articulate how that works. Like, what's the link? How is this going to work? Unfortunately, that's not always the case, but that's where the research being done and really trying to understand better those theories of change is critical. But we are now, our plan is to build latrines for peace. And what Mel really does is help make sure that we are on track with the plan. In other words, that we avoid this. That is what was implemented in the field. And obviously, it has very little to do with the original vision. It doesn't, you know, there were many steps, many warnings that could have heeded that a good monitoring and evaluation system could pick up on to make sure that we are reaching the vision, as Susanna mentioned. Maybe there are issues in the field, maybe there's procurement, maybe there's a number of reasons why the plan cannot be achieved as it is. That's why we need adaptation. That's what Mel is really good at. But, and this is the next point, this is actually what the community wanted, which is very different. It has, it uses local materials. It's something that they can clean up. There's washing station that is accessible from inside and outside. This is what local engagement. This is what ownership, this is what participation looks like. And so I know it's a little of a silly examples, but I find it very, very illustrative. And obviously the Latrines for Peace hopefully does not exist, I don't know. But we see this happening in across interventions. As I mentioned, I think Bushra was just talking about security. The reality is that if we are looking at security purely from a perspective of large-scale conflict type of intervention, then we are concerned with armed groups. But when you are talking with the community, their primary concern is not the armed groups. I mean, the armed groups are bad. Obviously, some events happen, but it's the day-to-day insecurity. It's like the small events, it's the burglaries, it's the fact that they cannot go to their field without taking a risk, not because of armed groups, but because of a range of other actors. So the concern is different. And if we talk to communities in Goma, that's what we did. We asked, well, what would help you feel more secure? Actually, the most important intervention, this is an urban setting. It's, again, I'm not advocating that that's what's needed everywhere else, but in that context, in that setting, it was street lighting at night. That was the main thing that people wanted to see happen to make them feel safer. And now, last point on this aspect of security, we've now good studies that show that there's actually not a very strong correlation between security incidents, what I would say, exposure to violence in the forms of attacks, in the forms of those things, and the sense of security. In other words, you have people who feel fairly safe in what would normally be considered the fairly high level of violence environment, but people feel safe for whatever reason. And in other places, there is no incidents, there's no violence, but people don't feel safe. And that influences behaviors. Because what matters is not whether there are attacks. What matters is, do you feel safe enough that you can go to your field? Do you feel safe enough that you can resume activities, that you can interact with people from other ethnic groups, for example? And so understanding these dynamics, this perception is really critical, and not something that we can always do in a very quantitative, very extractive manner. We need to talk to people. We need to engage. We need to understand what drives those sentiments. I'll stop here with those two examples and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm definitely thinking through the theory of change that links latrines to peace, but another conversation. Moving on to Ruth.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact than the other panelists because support everything that's been said, but pulling us back from the specific project level into how all the projects connect up in a specific context. So if we think about, the difference between Peace writ little, so on a project level, the way that you build a latrine or the way that you implement a specific set of activities within a PBSO project incredibly matters for how you're adapting, how you're designing all of those pieces. And to the next level, at a societal level change, peace building that requires the connective tissue between and among projects, requires that systems perspective to really get into the mindset of what is the value that sits between the spaces. So in thinking about that, we've got 20 years of very concrete evidence from case studies and a more collaborative learning approach, as well as randomized control trials and major evaluations and meta evaluations that tell us that what matters in making those connections is the insights that people in those communities are making. So if, just as a hypothetical, group of women in South Sudan that we were working with closely for a number of years, after a couple of months said, hey, we're also being asked to work on this other project. You're supporting us from a civil society perspective to be part of the peace building, or part of the peace agreement process. This other group is asking us a lot of questions related to our interests on how the political parties, what's the connection point there? And it forced us to say, let's talk about that, and let's go talk to these other groups that are working with these different types of activities, so that this group of women can more efficiently, effectively play the dot connecting roles. So if we think about that, what does that actually take to do to be effective and accountable in peace building? We can't not seek the local perspectives to give it. We can't guess about what those efficient and effective connection points would be. So it requires some of the feedback processes that Bushra was talking about, and some of the analysis points that Patrick and Susanna were talking about, thinking about feedback mechanisms, not that are invented or proven in other spaces, but that already exist within the spaces. How can we understand how those women in South Sudan are talking with each other and giving feedback to the organizations that they're working with through specific projects? How do we go meet them where they already are? Because that's something that will build trust in those mechanisms to actually be used. And then that closing the loop about how the evidence that is gathered is used, how groups are involved in analysis, in ownership of evidence, supported to make use of the evidence in their own ways, separate from what any project goals might be. This is what creates the ecosystem of using data for peace that is locally owned, locally generated, and locally valued. So I'll pause there with the one additional example. I'd love to bring into this conversation that Indigenous ways of knowing and the evidence and data that presents, we aren't structured yet to absorb that information as international systems, as project designers, or as people who are adapting to programs, thinking about that thick data, all of the stories, all of the conversations, all of the years of history in a particular context is a different type of big data than what our peace building field often has the ability to understand, think about, appreciate, value. And I think we can get a lot better at our peace building effectiveness if we get better at the mechanisms for seeking, understanding, valuing that kind of data.
Okay, great, thank you. Ruth, I think your last point is really a perfect segue into the second question I wanted to pose to the group, which is, can you talk about a specific obstacle in implementing local feedback data collection systems and how you would address it or you have addressed it in your implementation experience? And I'll start with Susanna again.
So I'm approaching this as a researcher who studies and evaluates all these processes. So I have been an implementer in a past life, but I am talking about my research on this. But I do have lots of examples. So I had kind of three obstacles that I wanted to talk about. One is when feedback is not used, when feedback does not go to decision makers, it is the number one issue. I feel like we are so good at gathering data, right? And so bad at feeding it into decision-making processes for a multitude of reasons. When I have seen that work, it's when you essentially flatten or reduce the distance between the feedback and the decision maker. And that means that the decision maker has to go toward the feedback. So in the cases of the examples that I gave, this M&E group made up of participants in a dialogue process, they were embedded in the decision-making structure. So they had direct access to the project's decision-making structure, right? Other times, it's amazing kind of when somebody actually goes on a field visit and goes to see what's happening, they've been receiving feedback and data all the time. A decision maker goes and actually sees what's happening, and then suddenly things start changing because they've actually come close to the data. So the key thing here is to realize that one of the biggest challenges in this field is our kind of physical, cultural, many other ways that we could talk about it, distance between the decision makers and their reality, right? And the people who are actually affected by the individual or collective programming efforts, right? So really coming up with innovative ways to get decision makers closer to the feedback so that they're not just reading it in a report, but they actually have to have some emotional experience in relation to it. And so that they gain some trust and relationship with those people giving the feedback, which means that they're going to get better feedback, right? Like that's how it works. So really thinking about ways to bring those closer together helps you to get a lot closer to action and decision making that actually is going to be based on that feedback. So the second one is when feedback is extractive without any informal accountability. So we're really good at kind of doing surveys, interviews, all this stuff that collects data, but we actually talk to different people all the time. We don't go back and talk to them. We don't actually use the kind of data collection process as a relationship building process, right? So once we begin to think about the data collection process as a relationship building process, then you actually can have some feedback that can be useful over time, right? Because you're benefiting from the trust that you get from those relationships. And that means people are going to invest more in you, and therefore you should invest more in them. Finally, is that feedback is really narrowed by headquarters metrics and indicators, right? So in the sense that if you're trying to kind of feed all the feedback from 20 countries into like 5 common indicators that are existing at headquarters, you are going to lose all of the nuance, right? So when I do research projects and I'm trying to come up with, you know, a global indicator, my job is to lose the nuance, right? So to understand that if your priority is measuring these global indicators, you will actually undermine and lose the wealth of evidence in your feedback mechanisms. And so that rather than supporting the feedback, it actually undermines it. That's it.
Okay, yeah, no, those are very useful points and they really resonate with me. Thank you, Susanna. Moving on to Bushra.
Thanks. You asked for one obstacle. I don't think you'll be able to get one obstacle from any of us because there are so many. Generally, I'll go to the solution first. 3IE has already come up with this lingo of TRIPS, which is training, resources, incentives, policy, signals. These are the kinds of things that you need to have at a system level to encourage these kinds of local feedback loops. But just to bring it down a little bit, I think a big factor is a sense of humility. When development actors, donors, government, anybody sees themselves as kind of a benefactor, and you lose that humility to actually realize that you need the people more than they need you in order to solve the problem that you're there for. So if you are going to set up local feedback loops, you have to choose a time of their convenience, not yours. You have to choose a location of their preference, not yours. You have to choose a tool that helps them, not you. That you have to work in a way that their earning is not affected, that you're respecting local cultures and traditions. So that's setting up those systems with a sense of humility. Genuine interest is quite important. The other is, understanding that kind of relationship building. So PBSO generally believes that we always have interagency partnerships. We work a lot with civil society. So there is a multiplicity of actors. We always work with national ownership because you need all these fundamental actors to work well together in order to serve eventually the people. So you have to go through traditional leadership as well, not just at local government or national government, but also the community leadership in order to access people and make sure, as Susanna mentioned earlier on, that you are talking to people in an inclusive way. So you are not just going during the day when, for instance, the men are at work and you're only going to get a female-driven population. Or you're not just going to places that are where the men go or where the older generation goes and the younger one doesn't. You have to make sure that you are adapting your feedback systems to the local context. Sometimes feedback loops also create this way of making false promises, because when people start telling you what's wrong, you can kind of create an expectation that you're there to also solve those problems that are outside the scope of your work. So it's very important not to raise expectations. But bringing it back to a little peace building component, we have to be very careful. that we don't re-victimize our communities. And our colleague recently at a country level shared this at our global, again, community of practice, where we share this knowledge, is sometimes our questionnaires are designed to ask people, have you ever been a victim of violence? Do you own a gun or a weapon? Or what happened? And so you have to make sure that when you're talking to people about what they've been through before, you are going to elicit certain emotional responses which are completely natural. So how do we do this in a way that we're not putting people at risk, that we are not making their life harder, that they're not afraid to give you this information that they are giving you, and they're writing it down for them, and that you're not doing more harm both in a physical and emotional way. So these are sensitivities that we need to be very, very cognizant of once we are designing and implementing that. And without that, even setting that up is kind of like a dangerous proposition. And that's one of the obstacles why people are at times even wary of setting these things up in the first place. And just wanted to say, harmonize academic knowledge, project knowledge with local knowledge, your language with their language. But there's not enough that can be said for what Susanna just said. If you're not flexible, if you don't change your programming based on what you're hearing, then there's no point to do it all. The whole point is to be humble, to be agile, to be flexible, to be risk averse and say, look, we said we were going to do this, but we have to now change because that's not what we thought was the problem, was actually not the problem. There's more nuance there, and we need to adapt ourselves and be flexible to it as well. So I'm just going to stop there and passing on to the next one.
Okay, I'm going to move to Patrick, but just a quick comment. I'm going to ask you to put together a paper helping us to like implement agility when we have, you know, the type of appropriations process that the US government has, which makes it very challenging. And I see my lights went off when I said that. So, okay. Anyway, so yeah, so moving on to Patrick.
That would be a wonderful resource, and one of the advantage of coming after such experienced and you know, erudite people as Susanna and Bushra is I don't have to restate a lot of the things that have been said. I think there are numerous constraints, whether it's the adaptation gap that is so critical. You know, where does consultation, where does M&E live within organization is very often either in outreach or communication, or it's in finance, and it's not with program very often. There are issues there are many technical and practical concerns, from how are you going to process, store, analyze, safeguard all this information, policies, how long will you keep it, what are you going to do with this information? I mean, you know, very important point on how you can consider data and the information gathered in these processes as an intervention into itself. And again, to give an example, in the DRC, we did go back to community with survey results and use it to say, okay, this is what people think is happening, what you think of that, or what you think should be done about this, and co-creating kind of learning and recommendation, and using M&E not just as informing other activities, but as an intervention in itself. Now, all this has been mentioned, so let me focus on one other big challenge with my handout. Let's talk about resources. Whether it's resources that is taken to take the time to understand local means and practices around feedback and engagement. The reality is that if I'm an actor, it is way easier for me to say, this is going to be our helpline, and if anyone wants to give us feedback, this is the helpline. That can be set up in one day. But that is only going to give you some kind of feedback. And now we have good data that community-based feedback mechanism get a very different type of feedback than helpline. Helpline is very good at the technical side of things. I lost my card. How do I replace that? How do I access this? But very bad at learning around the practices about some of the protection challenges, for example. So there needs to be time. There needs to be resources allocated for that learning. There needs to be resources that go into training, into data literacy, into technological literacy. The reality is that we have at hands increasingly complex tools. It is nobody's mandate to train the implementing partners. Nobody cares as to our feedback mechanism is a proprietary, I never managed to say that word in English, is not something that is accessible to local organizations once we leave. Should we use it? Probably it's not a good idea because it doesn't leave resources in the future. So I think really thinking through the resources that are needed, the gaps in understanding, again, and I'm rambling, but on engagement, everyone talks about engagement. There is a big gap in how do we do that well. There are some interesting studies, but there's much more that can be done on how do we do this more effectively. So I look forward to the book, Susanna, Bushra.
Thank you. Ruth.
So just to locate the perspective that I'm coming from, CDA as the organization that brought Do No Harm and some of the earliest peace building effectiveness frameworks into this conversation, we sit across two different nexus places. So one is the humanitarian development peace building nexus, and we have lots of research and evidence about those spaces. And the other is across policy, practice, and research spaces. So we're convening with lots of different kinds of communities from lots of different perspectives. And the evidence is clear. In all of those spaces, we are fundamentally not structured to use, value local evidence and to bring that in, whether it's through feedback loops or through survey analysis or just through the relationship building and the listening. The time and humility that it takes in order to do that is not part of our current structure. All right. So if we know that, and study after study is telling us that, what needs to change? And from our perspective, the places where we see the bright spots of change are where there's a mentality shift from leadership, a capacity perspective from people in management positions, where there are deep relationships within communities, where peace builders are trying to go deep instead of broad. You know, all of those things that we know are important, but we don't often structure ourselves to practice. And so the mentality shift that's needed in our sector right now is really getting quite acute. So just two examples of this, you know, one with recent research with USIP, US Institute of Peace, for their learning agenda, doing an evidence review about what actually matters, what kind of evidence matters in peace building project design. And we heard through lots of different types of sources of evidence that what really matters is the information that comes from relationships that can be immediately incorporated into either designing programs or adapting programs. So that's something that we heard in really diverse spaces. Last week at the Berlin Climate and Security Conference, you know, a specific application of evidence and data in our field for peace building goals with a major new risk factor, not new to many communities, but major new discussion about how these issues are interconnected. We're getting more and more dialed in on how to predict where violence is going to occur or predict the impact of climate change on peace and conflict dynamics, but then, you know, full calls, but without a lot of specifics about how we incorporate local knowledge, local data into the, you know, what do you actually do with that big data? And so how we get in conversation between the big data and the local data, how we listen across those spaces to more effectively understand interests, constraints, opportunities, to merge those types of data sets, to really understand what the barriers are to bringing listening into the conversation. So, you know, those are two examples. We can provide many others, but we know the traps. And I think that that's the place where we can start to activate, to say, how do we break some of the mentality barriers that then can help us shift the structural barriers and come back to that center of humanity, humility, understanding power, and eroding some of the issues that are bigger than any one project or any one sector.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Yes, and I agree on the challenges of that kind of aggregated synthesis and dialogue between the big data and the local data, which is so essential. So those are the questions I wanted to pose to the panel. I certainly have more questions I could ask, but I want to go ahead and open it up to the audience, because I can see that we have a lot of other experts on this call, some of which are in my own office at F and elsewhere. So I think our first question, and it's up to the moderator to unmute people, I believe. But the first question is from Pam in Africa. Pam, I'm not sure.
Pamina
Okay,
first.
Pamina first show. Thanks, Susanna. I can't seem to unvideo myself or video myself, I suppose. I can't.
Okay.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, well, anyway, I'll just speak.
Eugene, can you help us? Whoever's on the line from NYU. Because
Well,
I think, yeah. Okay, go ahead. It's okay.
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Pamina Furshow, and I'm an associate professor at Brandeis University in the Coexistence and Conflict Resolution program, and also the founding executive director of Everyday Peace Indicators.
Oh, sorry for butchering your name like that, but thank you.
Oh,
Thanks for joining us.
no worries at all. I know it's not quite clear here on Zoom for some reason. I can't put a space between my names.
No worries.
So I had 3 questions, and I'm going to try to do this really quickly because I know that there are other people who must have questions. First of all, I'd like to ask the panelists a question that I always get, which is about scale. So with Everyday Peace Indicators, we're collecting individualized indicators of peace, of signs that everyday people look to in their daily lives to determine whether or not they are more or less at peace. And we do this at the very local level, the community level. And like Patrick said, there may be a community that is needing or prioritizing or looking at latrines for peace, whereas another one that might be more concerned with putting up street lights, or another one with removing a military base, for example, right? When we're talking about peace or when we're talking about security specifically. And so my question is, considering the constraints of the international community, and the fact that there's limited funding and limited bandwidth for engagement, for meaningful engagement with communities, and to really tailor programming at the community level, how can we really attend to those localized differences between that manifest themselves at the village level, right? There's really different needs from village to village. And this is a question that I always get because there's this real concern with scaling. And because, of course, when we're talking about policy and when we're talking about international cooperation, thinking about just one community, it's just, it's too myopic. So how do we scale? Then the other question that I had was about relationships. And I mean, Ruth talked about this, and also Patrick talked a bit about it. I mean, all of you really spoke about it, but what we see in our work and in our research is that relationships between institutions or implementing organizations and the communities that they're serving are possibly more important for conflict response or peace building than the actual interventions they're carrying out. So how can we use MEL and M&E to build those relationships better? And is it is it possible to use data and to use the requirements that we have in monitoring and evaluation currently, and the way that it's structured, where it's more focused on reporting to donors rather than, engaging communities? Is there a way that we can use MEL in a more productive way to build those relationships? So maybe, like Ruth said, how do we go deeper and broader while still working within those constraints? And then finally, in terms of engagement, I recognize, so Susanna talked a lot about feedback and needing to engage decision makers, and I absolutely agree with that. But what about feedback engaging communities? Because even though, Patrick mentioned that, sometimes data is an intervention itself, but when I see MEL programs and the kinds of research projects and evaluations that we conduct with Everyday Peace Indicators, the community engagement piece is sorely neglected. In fact, when we think about the term monitoring and evaluation, or even monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or even design, monitoring, and evaluation and learning, the engagement piece is completely left out. Nobody is talking about using that data to actually engage communities, to actually give back, or few people, I shouldn't say nobody. Patrick clearly was talking about it, but how can we do that more? And is there, I guess, potential and space for donors to realize the importance of engaging communities with their data? Thank you.
Thank you. So those were great questions. 3 of them. I guess I'll just ask, I'm not sure the best way, but maybe one, whoever wants to jump in, let's say on question 1, if we could do it that way. Question 1 is on the scale one. Who wants to jump in and answer that one?
Michelle, do we want to take some more questions given our time?
All right, that's a good idea. Okay, do we have more questions? Especially if I have, any of my USG colleagues who need to try and integrate these ideas, please feel free to jump in. Any other questions? Eugene, do you have any? Well, given that, then I think we can just move forward with these questions. So maybe I'll just let us do a round robin. We can go until 10 till because we started late. So Susanna?
Great questions, Pamina. I want to take a shot at 2 of them. The way that I always think about scale is very much in terms of matching the data collection to whatever the kind of action is supposed to be, right? And so yes, if you're trying to make national level decisions, feedback from one community doesn't make any sense. It's also not representative necessarily of the broader context. And so thinking about, if you want to take feedback from the community level, like you're doing with EPI, and aggregate that up to influence national level decision making, then you actually have to cover enough communities to be able to claim some representation. And that's not to say that that's not going to be an extremely valuable exercise, but then that cost would have to be weighed against, the value of that perspective, which at particularly tumultuous times in a country's kind of progression and a conflict could be extremely important. So I think that really it's about thinking about helping the data and the level at which you're connecting the data to meet the level at which decisions are being made. And so if it's country level decision making, then you're going to have to figure out how to get some type of representation from the country level. And there's always going to be shortcuts, right? So maybe you're taking actors who represent them not at the community level, maybe it's a few communities, and then you're taking a few kind of mid-level civil society actors who may represent another diverse group. So the point is that this is never going to be perfect, but you're trying to actually have some sense. The most important things there are that the diversity of perspectives are represented, right? And are really communicated to the decision makers at the level at which they can act. And I want to address the kind of the engagement point is that I think Bushra actually talked about how they were engaging communities. And I think I drew like a feedback loop is never just one way, right? So it always goes around, it's a loop. And so I think the real challenge is and I think it's much clearer when the data collection is embedded in the programming process, the feedback loop to communities and what that should be is much easier to do. When the data collection is completely separate from a programming process, then what feedback looks like is much more difficult, right? Because you're going and telling them, hey, this is what we heard. This is what we heard you say. And then what are they supposed to do with it? So I would kind of think about how should community-based feedback in particular be connected to real programmatic opportunities to act on that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Bushra, do you want to respond?
Yes, again, I'm not going to repeat what Susanna already said about scale. It really does depend on the kind of programming and the functioning that we have. On the relationships, on the engagement bit, engagement for me, like inclusivity or gender responsiveness, is a cross-cutting thing. It should be part of your system, whether it's design or monitoring or evaluation or learning. And like we already said, it has to be continuous. It's a loop that you have to keep going back to complete. So like the example that we gave from our PBF project earlier, we took the data, but we took it back to them because again, it's not just about taking, it's also about rebuilding and understanding the dynamic. And this is at a baseline state. So we hope to continue to do that over time as well. And that actually does create relationships in itself, that kind of engagement, because you are facilitating and creating this environment of trust that you are of value to us. We're not just here to implement activities. You are who we're accountable to. And that kind of relationship building comes from that engagement. But the relationship building across actors, and I'm going to talk about this with something that Patrick mentioned earlier as well, is about resources. So like we said, PBSO, we have joint projects. We work across multiple actors, but we are also talking very much in this culture of accountability. Is this culture, or in this culture of where everybody is struggling to mobilize resources at their end, that kind of unified sense of all development actors are working together doesn't work so well if they're all independently looking for researches, for additional resources. So that relationship building may very well exist because there is a program, but there's also a fear of not performing or failing, and then how that can affect their own sustainability as an organization or their ability to mobilize additional resources. So a lot of it is when you have depleting resources around peace building, when you're not able to bring actors together and work collectively, you are going to lose that trust. Right. So in a way, we also have to talk about the kind of resource environment that we're living in, the kind of accountability-centric thinking that we have, which is a big factor in the relationships not being built. So again, pool funding, interagency, or joint kind of programming with the ability to take risks is something that can strengthen relationships as well. And Patrick, we do build capacities of partners, of implementing partners because you cannot work without them. And sometimes just implementation in itself builds capacities, but also, yes, increasingly it's being built in as part of programming as well, especially as we further our localization agenda.
Thank you. And we only have 5 more minutes. So I'm just going to ask, Patrick, if you want to respond for 2 minutes, and then Ruth, although I do see one of my colleagues who would like to ask a question. So hopefully we'll get to it.
I'll go very quickly. I do want to talk to the question of scale with a slightly different angle, and I'll be cautious. The community does not always know best. And what's important, I mean, we see this all the time. So, or it's not that it knows better, it's that there are sometimes conflict between norms. I work a lot on accountability, and whether I'm in northern Uganda 20 years ago, in Iraq a few years ago, or in Ethiopia a month ago, you have communities, when you ask them what should be done with those responsible for violence, we should kill them all. We should punish with it, we should kill them. And other communities say, other individuals will say, no, you know what, let's just forgive, let's just move on, let's just basically grant amnesties. None of these are acceptable to international actors. The support for death penalty is not there, and support for amnesty is not there either. The point I'm trying to make with this, and I know is about the dialogue, is the fact that you collect the data, you're not going to always be able to address every need of every community. But by understanding what those needs are, you can, one, adapt your program to the extent that you maximize how much you'll be able to meet those needs. And then you can dialogue and explain, well, you know what, you need A, you need B, but my mandate is to do C. So let's figure out how we can do this. And give me just a simple example. Again, memorials are a good idea. Building memorials to remember what has happened is a good idea. But then we see a lot of people opposed to it. Why? Typically associated with trauma. I don't want to see something that reminds me of what I've experienced every day. So what do? Do we not build memorials, or do we build them and re-traumatize people? Well, maybe the adaptation is to build memorials, but accompany it with some psychosocial programs, or build it in a way that involves the community and reduces the likelihood of trauma. And so that goes to the relation. And I do want to mention that there is really high value in rigor, in quality of evidence, because that is what gives you the ability to talk with people who don't necessarily, I mean, we've seen it in Central African Republic with the data and peace program at HHI, or in the Congo. We're able to get people to sit at the table because they trust the data. They trust that we're not there to judge. We're just saying, look, this is what people are saying, let's discuss. And so that engagement is a really important part of M&E. If you're able to have data that's trustworthy, I'm not going to talk about the community level engagement. I do think it's much more present than we sometimes give it credit. But at the same time, there are issues where it doesn't lead to adaptation in programs. Over to you.
Thank you. I see a comment in the chat. Thank you for that. I just want to let my colleague Matt St. John just ask one question, and maybe just one person can answer. Matt, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Yeah,
we're fine. We got you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for the comments. I think this has been very interesting. My question is really about, you've talked about scale of these things. And so I started to think about the scale of data, scale of how you're implementing MEL, the rigor of the data. My question is really about is, collecting the data, grassroots collecting the data, feedback loops back to communities, of course, is a positive thing at the community level, both for any kind of development interventions as well as any interventions whatsoever from implementers and things like that. My question is about how can we ensure, or what is the best ways that maybe some of you have seen in having that type of data that is at that grassroots level able to effectively influence high-level strategies? And what I mean by that, sometimes I've been struggling with, it's sort of incongruent, right? You're collecting data and turning it around at the local community level, and in MEL, it's an issue that we have on like unit of measurement, right? When you're doing an evaluation, is unit of measurement the individual, is it the family, is it the community, is it the national level? So if you're collecting data at the individual level, how do you use that data to influence strategies? And the reason why that's important, I think, is because when you're talking about effectively, implementing interventions or development or any types of national strategies, it's best for accountability and effectiveness that it's responsive to the local conditions and things like that. How do you, instead of just saying, oh, we just roll it up, oftentimes a lot of people say, oh, we just roll it up to the high level strategy. I think that's a cop-out. What is the best way to really have effective grassroots data that's actually integrated into high-level strategies at a national or international level so that it positively affects those communities? Thanks.
That's a great question. Can I just ask maybe Susanna, will you respond to that? Because we've been talking a lot about that in the Global Fragility Act strategic MEL.
Sure,
Susanna.
I wasn't sure if Ruth also wanted to.
Okay,
go.
all right. I think we have a few more minutes. So
okay.
Did you want
Ruth, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to jump in. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm a geographer, so I think a lot about scale and the specific question of how we bring specific examples into policy discussions is really one of the things that we focus on very specifically. So if we think about the starting point, right? So if this conversation so far has been primarily about people external from the context seeking information from community members. There's a way to bring the decision makers closer to those people providing information by talking to local peace builders and putting them at the center of data analysis, data collection, strategies, methods, and how those messages get aggregated, get analyzed, and brought to policy conversations. So that's an important thing to be thinking about, not just at a specific context level, but at a regional or global issue level. So, looking at how different communities, hyperlocal level, define different aspects of peace and conflict or resilience or whatever the metric might be, and then looking across those definitions to say, what's common? And knowing that you'll always need to go back to the specific context for your implementation activities. But if you look at what's common across, that can be the thematic of what you take to the policymakers about what matters in lots of different situations. I would also say inviting policymakers to stretch the muscle of listening by putting themselves into spaces where they're listening directly to local peace builders. So there's a locally led peace builders community of practice. There's the Nexus platform. The Rotary Peace Centers have a lot of next generation leaders in these spaces. The UN hosts events, universities host events. Stretching the muscle, maybe it's a quarterly basis, commit to going to one conference or one conversation where you're having to listen to how different the conversation is amongst local peace builders versus the policy conversations, and how to bridge that gap will really start to think about effectiveness.
And sorry, Ruth, did you want to add anything from the prior question? Sorry about that the prior set of questions, or just leave it at that?
I think we can leave it at that.
Okay. Does anyone else want to jump in to address Matt's question?
I'll hop in quickly, if that's okay. I think, well, Matt, Patrick wrote it. In the health world, they do this well. DHS surveys are hugely useful, but we also have the Afrobarometer or other barometers out there that are actually asking peace and governance questions regularly of a population. So there are data out there, right? I think the biggest, and what I hear in your question is, fine, there are data out there, but how do we actually take that to influence decision makers? And what Ruth said is absolutely right. And, bring them closer to the problem, help them to have some real experience with the other reality. The other thing that I saw, which CARE Burundi actually did, was they put their staff in the communities. They actually sent them there to live. And so it's the idea that no extraction and a synthesis of data. The problem with that process is that you lose the experience of that. If you're just counting kind of numbers of people killed, or you have no experience of what that actually feels like, right? And therefore what action you need to take. And so part of the reducing the gap between kind of evidence and action is about finding ways to get the actors closer to the evidence that you're trying to get them to act on. That's it.
Very interesting. I think we have to close out. I would have loved for Bushra and Patrick to chime in, but I think they have another there's another panel starting, I believe. Is that correct, Eugene? Do you want to respond to that question, to Matt's question, or I don't want to exclude anyone? I think we're good. I think this has been a really interesting conversation and a good counterpoint to the focus on maybe what's considered the more high-tech data sets that we're talking about a lot these days, and just such an important data type. And I feel like I've learned from you today to advance our Global Fragility Act MEL group work. And I just want to thank our panelists for their time today. And hopefully, maybe we can do this in another forum and do part 2. So thank you again, NYU and CRAF'd. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks so much. This was great.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.